Hi, welcome back to Lost in Translation. Again, this is a series where we're looking at key biblical words that have lost something of their meaning by virtue of their translation from one word, one language to another, one culture to another, one place and time to another, one literary context to another. All right, so the word I want to look at today is the word dikaiosune in Greek, which we often translate righteousness. I want to look at the word itself and then the word as it occurs in a recurring phrase in the Bible, particularly a phrase in Paul's letters, and then the word as it occurs in a particular verse. I want to talk about how at each level there's something lost in translation with this word. All right. First, the word itself. We translate dikaiosune in English righteousness. Sometimes we translate it justice. And just so you'll know that this word, this single word, the stem behind this word, anytime you see in Paul's letters the words righteousness, righteous, or making or declaring righteous, or on the other hand, the words justice, that's the noun, the verb justify, or the adjective just, any of those words, it's all this same root. Um, our word dikaiosune, righteousness. It's all that same root. So I want to talk about the noun, righteousness. Our word in English, righteousness, often kind of for us signifies virtue or just a kind of general goodness. And so already there's something, we don't have a word that quite connotes what this word means in Greek. We're already losing something there because in the original Greek, particularly in a Jewish context, the word refers more to a relational uprightness, a relational fidelity. It's not just a static virtue or a static goodness that I, in and of myself, have. It's more of a fidelity or uh, an uprightness that is active in relationship. So when we talk about God's righteousness or a good man's righteousness. We're talking about a relational, an active relational uprightness. Secondly, this word occurs in a recurring phrase throughout Paul's letters, especially, but it's also found in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The phrase is dikaiosune theou. Theou is the word for God. And this phrase will get translated two different ways, depending on which translation you pick up and which verse you're looking at. But your translations will differ in how to translate this phrase. Sometimes the phrase is translated righteousness from God. Righteousness from God. Other times, your translations will translate this righteousness of God. In other words, God's righteousness. So think about the difference. And both translations are possible in this phrase. On the one hand, righteousness from God would refer to a gift of righteousness that He gives us, if you translate it that way. On the other hand, if you translate it righteousness of God or God's righteousness, that refers to God's own character, God's own righteousness. So the phrase, does it refer to a gift of righteousness God gives us, or does it refer to God's own character, God's own quality, his quality of relational fidelity? Well, this debate over how to translate this phrase really comes to a head when you turn to Romans 1:17. And I'll invite you to turn to Romans 1:17. When you do that, you'll see that it's going to be translated one of these two ways, depending on whatever translation you have. Now, let me say something about Romans 1:17. Romans 1:17 is, by all accounts, the thesis of Romans. Very rarely do commentators agree on something when it comes to Romans or the Bible generally, but virtually everybody agrees. Romans 1:17, together with verse 16, is the thesis of Romans. So in this verse, and I just want to focus on the very first half of this verse for this little installment, Paul begins by saying, in the gospel, in it, and some of your translations will say, a righteousness from God is revealed. So in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed. If you translate it that way, it means this gift of righteousness is revealed, the gift of justification, kind of a gift of salvation. If you translate it the other way, it says something very different. In it, in the gospel, God's righteousness, or the righteousness of God, God's own righteousness is revealed. Again, you can translate this phrase both ways. Both are legitimate ways of translating it. So what is Paul talking about? In the gospel is a gift of justification, a gift of righteousness being revealed to us? Or in the gospel is God revealing his own active fidelity, his own relational uprightness, his own righteousness? I want to make the case that it's the second, not the first. And it depends on what translation you're reading. The older NIV reads a righteousness from God, as though it's a gift of justification. The King James, I think, gets it right. The King James has a righteousness of God, God's own righteousness. And by the way, more and more interpreters and translations are going with that second option. Why? Well, a couple of reasons, and then I'll talk about the significance. I really want to get to why I think this is important. First of all other things being equal, it's more natural to translate it God's righteousness as opposed to a righteousness from God. That's because if a Greek speaker would likely use the preposition from if there was any debate about which it could be. And in this case, since it can go either way, a Greek speaker would probably use the word from if that was what he or she intended. So all other things being equal, righteousness of God is more likely. More importantly, and this is where I think we begin to get into the significance of the phrase. In the Old Testament, in the Greek translation of it, the Septuagint, this phrase occurs over and over again in the prophets. And in those contexts, it almost always refers to God's own righteousness. And in particular, a particular expectation that at the end of history, God would finally unveil his own righteousness. Now, what do the prophets mean by this? This relational fidelity. In the context of the Old Testament prophets, what they were imagining was that God would finally reveal his covenantal faithfulness, his covenantal righteousness, his covenantal fidelity. God had made promises from the very beginning in the biblical narrative to Abraham that he would make a great nation of Abraham, and through that nation, God would bless all nations. And the prophets are writing at a time when they're still wondering, is God going to follow through on these promises? And the prophets are saying, yes, God will. At the end of history, God will finally make good on his covenant promises. And those covenant promises concern all nations, not just Israel. And it concerns the cosmos. God will repair all things. God will right the world. N.T. Wright likes to talk about this phrase, the righteousness of God, is referring to God's world-righting righteousness. It's his world-correcting, his world-fixing, his world-repairing righteousness. In other words, when the prophets use this phrase, they're not talking about a gift of justification, a gift of righteousness from God. They're talking about the hope of all history, the hope of all creation, that God will finally unveil his world-righting righteousness. He'll follow through and keep his covenant promises to repair all things. So why do I think this matters? Well, if we translate it in the more narrow way of in the gospel, a gift of righteousness is being revealed, a righteousness from God, then we've made the whole gospel very individualistic. It's nothing more than a transaction between God and me. God is giving me the gift of justification. And yes, Paul does talk about God giving us a gift of but his portrait of the gospel is much broader than that. It isn't focused just on the individual's justification. But if we translate it, God's righteousness is being revealed in the gospel. What we're talking about now is something that is much larger than the individual. It's God's own character repairing the world, repairing all nations, blessing all nations. It's corporate in nature and cosmic in nature, corporate in scope and cosmic in scope. It's not just settled on the individual. And I think it's important, if we're going to be true to the gospel that Paul preached, to be clear that the gospel is good news more than just for the individual narrowly, but it's good news for the world. It's good news for all ethnicities, for Jew and Gentile alike. Secondly, this translation that I think that I'm proposing is more accurate. It is historical in scope, whereas the older Protestant translation of righteousness from God is kind of ahistorical. If we translate Romans 1:17 as referring to in the gospel a righteousness from God is given, there we're talking about a transaction that occurs between God and me just in this moment when I'm believing. It has nothing to do with history. It's just this transaction that occurs when I believe God gives me the gift of justification, if we translate it that way. But I don't think that's what Paul's talking about. When Paul says in the gospel, God's righteousness is revealed, he's talking about a hope for the end of history that is sown at the beginning of history. It goes all the way back to Abraham's promises, to the promise God made to Abraham, rather, that through you I'll make a great nation, and through that nation I'll bless all nations. Well, the prophets look to the end of history when that hope is finally fulfilled, when God finally unveils his world-writing righteousness, his world-writing covenantal fidelity. Um, so the gospel, instead of being ahistorical, concerns all of history, and that way of translating it helps us to see that we're kind of at the end of history. We are at the beginning of the end when God has begun to unveil how He's repairing the world. Um, I think lastly, what I would say is if we translate it narrowly in the first manner, a righteousness from God is revealed. All that repairs is my own sinfulness. If all we're saying in Romans 1:17, if all Paul is saying in Romans 1:17 is in the gospel, a gift of righteousness is given to me. All that's repaired there is my own sinning. But if we say in the gospel, God's righteousness, his world-writing righteousness is unveiled, there, it's not, yes, my own sinning is repaired, but so is all that is wrong with the world. The gospel is the good news of how all things are made new. So the power of death in the world is done away with. The division between ethnicities is done away with. Injustice, war, that's all repaired. Any form of disrepair, any form of dysfunction, including my sinning, but all the way up to death as it affects the cosmos in its entirety. All of that is being repaired. Why? Because at the end of history, God has unveiled his world-writing righteousness.